Welcome, 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 everyone. So happy to have you here with us tonight. I'm Carol Fitzgerald from Reading Group Guides, a website from the Book Report Network, and I want to welcome you to our evening event where our Bookaccino live book group, where our guest this evening is Ann Napolitano, and we are going to be discussing her New York Times best-selling novel, Hello Beautiful, which is also Oprah's 100th book group selection. Last May, our book reporter reviewer, Rebecca Monroe, said, Hello Beautiful is a sweeping, perceptive, and beautifully rendered family saga that could only be achieved by an author at the height of her literary powers. Book clubs will no doubt find much to reflect on, discuss, and deepen their connections with this generous, healing novel. And I just love that because I think it encompasses so much of what this book is about. So let's talk about what the format tonight is going to be. Let's start by noting that we're going to assume that everyone has read Hello Beautiful. So we're going to be talking spoilers. By this time, we would assume that that's what you have read. I'm going to begin with a discussion with Anne, and then a couple of our readers will be joining us live to talk about Hello Beautiful, and I'll be asking a couple of questions for more camera-shy folks. Then we're going to turn the conversation to her latest book, which actually was her first book that came out in 2004, which has recently come back into publication, Within Arm's Reach. So we will have someone share a question from this, and we're going to talk about re-releasing this book and what was that all about. Then we're going to go to audience Q&A. As the evening goes on, please drop your questions into the Q&A area. Our voice of God, Tom Donadio, will be jumping on, and he will be working on making sure that the questions are ones that haven't been asked before, just to keep the evening moving ahead. And I think that's all the details that we have to have. Once again, if you're joining us now, if you could just jump in the chat and tell us who you are and where you're from, we would absolutely love that. And remember, questions in the Q&A. And with that housekeeping behind us, let's welcome Anne to the stage. Hi, Anne.
Carol. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. Absolutely love this. So let's turn back the clock. Let's go back in time and talk about the writing of Hello Beautiful, which was back in 2020, I believe. So we're going back 4 years. And, I've read that you have a very specific way that you nurture an idea for a book before you start writing. So let's start there for sort of the genesis of where the book is going to go.
Okay, so it's true, my process has changed over the years, and for Dear Edward and for Hello Beautiful, this is how I do it. So as soon as I have the beginning of an idea for the book, and in this instance, the beginning of the idea was a lonely little boy dribbling a basketball. I had this image of this boy. I set in sort of invisible timer inside myself for 9 months. And for the next 9 months, I am not allowed to write. I'm not allowed to do what I call writing pretty sentences, which is what I love to do, which is where I start in a scene and I'm following the lyricism of the language and things happen I didn't expect. But the thing is, when I write like that, I cannot think cerebrally at all. It shuts off that part of my brain. So by having this 9-month period, where the only thing I'm allowed to do is think, research, and take notes and try to figure out as much as I can, in my head and through research and brainstorming, etc. I can figure out who's in the book and then what I think is going to happen. And then by the time the timer goes off, I can enter the world with a firmer foundation than I could if I just started writing, which is what I used to do in the past. So I had the idea for the lone little boy dribbling a basketball. There's an obsession that leads me into every book, and this obsession was an obsession with the history of basketball.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, I know, very weird actually. Which is, I always tell my students that if your obsession seems odd and it's something you had never chosen to be obsessed with, that it really generally has a sign that it has something to do with your work.
Right.
And I grew up playing soccer. My children play soccer. My husband plays soccer. So I know a lot about soccer. I knew very little about basketball, but I started reading about social justice, and that led me to reading sort of the parallel line of the formation of the basketball leagues in the United States. and figures like Bill Russell and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who were very involved in the civil rights movement. And all of a sudden, I could not read enough nonfiction books about basketball. So that was part of it. So I knew that basketball was going to factor into this book.
Mhm.
And I knew that I wanted to write about sort of a pack of sisters.
Mhm.
And my best friend growing up lived down the street, and I slept at her house like as often as I slept at my own house. And her mother has 6 sisters, and they would walk in and out of the house at all hours. They were all about 5 foot tall. They're Italian American, and they all had slightly different versions of the same face. And they seemed more themselves when they were together than they did when they were apart. And I used to watch them like they were a television show when I was at her house. And it was really that sisterhood that I was thinking of when I was sort of coming up with this idea of the 4 sisters and their relationship and their like special closeness. I interviewed an NBA physio. I learned about mental health treatments in the 1980s because that was one of the ideas I had in the book. So I had all these ideas for who the people were, etc. And then when the timer went off, the 9-month timer, it went off in April 2020,
Mm.
and which was a very unusual time. And I live in Brooklyn, so like we were fully shut down at the beginning of the pandemic. There were like sirens going by all the time. And in April as well, my father died.
Mm.
And because of the timing of the pandemic, like so many people, we weren't able to be with him while he was dying. And then we weren't able to gather after he died.
Mm.
So it was it was probably like the most emotionally disorienting month of my life, but the timer had gone off. So I started writing this book. And I think because of the state that I was in and the grief and the sort of everything was so heightened, like it felt like this book like completely pulled me in a way that none of my other books have, where I was writing this book like to save myself as well as William and to have my own to show my own grief and act out my own grief for the father of the Padavano sisters.
Mhm.
And I wrote it in 2 years, which is it may not sound fast, but for me it's very fast because it's really all I did. I was like very, very consumed by this book.
When the 9-month timer goes off, are you anxious to write? Are you
Yeah.
saying, I'm ready to go? Like tomorrow
Yeah.
morning, getting up and we're taking it off.
Yeah, I hate not writing. Not writing is really hard for me. It's like brushing your teeth. It's like you took 9 months off from brushing your teeth. Because which would be terrible, right? That
Yes.
would be awful. So I'm very ready and very excited, and like it's like writing is so for my health and everything, just like it lights me up, and so I'm so desperate by the time the timer goes off. I'm so ready, which is part of why it works. It's good because
Mhm.
it makes me sort of take a break, and it also means that I'm very excited when I get to do it again.
And you've given a lot of thought to what's going to happen, how it could possibly work. At the same time, do you know the ending before you begin? Are you writing towards that, or are you still playing with character and setting and things that are
No, I
happening?
It depends. For Dear Edward, I knew the ending. For Hello, but really that was because it's about a plane crash, so I knew the plane was going to crash in the end.
Exactly.
It was pretty easy. But Hello, Beautiful, I did not know how it was going to end. What I really wanted to find out was that if someone if someone went through the childhood that William had, where he was unloved by his parents and so didn't have any of the infrastructure inside himself for kindness and love, like could that person ever be okay? And I didn't know if he could. So I knew he was going to walk through darkness, but I didn't know what that was going to look like either. But really what compelled me through the book at the center line was what's going to happen to William? Can
Mhm.
he be okay?
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer.
You don't know the answer at that time.
No. Mm-mm.
When you start writing, then do you revise along the way? Like, do you get up and say, oh, I'm going to revise what I already did, or you just keep going and then say, let me fix it later?
I revise all the time. I mean, my ideal situation is that I'm working on a new chapter, and then throughout the day, I'll go to the chapter before it and revise, and then go back to the new chapter. And so I'm always revising. And
Right.
I try not to write like the last quarter of the book until I really know everything. So I'll rewrite the first 2/3 over and over and over again until I feel like the foundation is really solid, and then I'll write the end because I don't want to get the end wrong. It's like too fraught.
Yeah. It'll be at that moment where, wait a second, I have to have this. The closure's got to be there.
Yeah.
But how
Yeah.
did I get to the closure? I always think it's like, you're building like the back end of a clock to get everything to move into the right directions. And then sometimes something's a little awry, that it's not going to leave the time forward, or it's not going to do something, and you have to sit and play with it. Then
Yeah.
at what point does your agent editor see it? Do they see it along the way, or when you got a good first draft?
Well, the Hello Beautiful is different than anything. All my other books, they didn't see it until it was done. And then I did revision for them. But for Hello Beautiful, partly because I started writing it at the beginning of the pandemic and everything was so weird.
Hmm.
I gave my agent like the first 100 pages, and really just to get her feedback. And she was like, "Oh, I think we should sell this, and you should," because I knew I wanted to work with the same editor that I had for Dear Edward, who I adore. And so actually they both got brought in from about the 100 page point. And then I would hand them 60 pages at a time until we got to the end of a first draft. And then I rewrote the whole first draft, but in concert with them, really.
But you also realize that they also had more time. They
Yeah,
also had more
yeah.
time. It's like, oh, it's not like they were going out to lunch. It's not like there was a dinner
No,
evening. No, it was a
no.
lot more time to get everything done.
Yeah, exactly. And I dedicated the book to the two of them because really I felt like we did these Zoom sessions every few months, and it was like it was wonderful for all three of us, I think, to sort of talk about something fictional and that felt important and wasn't.
Yeah, and you just realize that when you think back on how crazy that time actually was. I mean, we're only
Yeah,
talking 2 years of people's lives, and especially you with having children and
yeah,
seeing what was happening. The whole thing was just like whoosh, like this.
yeah.
And I think that we're still seeing the ramifications of it, and we're going to be seeing them for a while, of where
Oh,
those 2 years of not having socialization, not having all these other things really, exploded.
mhm.
Well, Debbie is going to join us. She's one of our longtime Bookaccino Live book group participants. She's joining us from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, where she winters before she heads back up north. This woman is bright, Debbie, what do you have for us for questions?
Hi, and it's really nice to meet you. I
Yeah.
love these books. And most of your books revolve around family dynamics, in particular about the roles that each person plays in a family. What interests you about that dynamic?
Mm. That's a great question. I just think it's fascinating. I mean, I'm like, what's not interesting about that? Isn't that interesting to everybody? Um, I mean, I just it's growing up in a family, and I was the oldest, and I certainly see how I played the role of the oldest. I see how my sister was the middle one, and I see how my significantly sort of younger brother was the baby. And then also it's endlessly interesting to me that as you grow and change and as challenges happen that affect the family, people's roles have to change, and how people react to that shift. Some people can take it in stride and other people can't. And then I discovered in the pandemic too, when my father died, it was really interesting to have like a key figure drop out of a family structure, and to see that it really throws everyone's roles up in the air again was not something I would have anticipated. So over the course of a long history, I think I find it just endlessly interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah, that was sort of a lead into my next question, which was, over time, the roles of these sisters changed and their relationships changed. When you started to write the book, did you know that, or did you develop their characters over time as you got to know them while you were writing them?
I figured out I figured out sort of the basic essence of who each of the sisters was before I started writing. Like that Julia, as the oldest, was like the fixer, and that Sylvie was more the dreamer, and she worked in a library. And I knew that Cecilia was an artist. And the real neighborhood that they live in, Pilsen in Chicago, is covered with murals, and Cecilia becomes a muralist. And I knew that Emmeline was sort of the caretaker. But that's obviously like one note. And I didn't know more than that until I started writing them. And then I knew, there are no spoilers, right? So, I mean, I don't have to worry about spoiling. So like I knew that two of the sisters were going to become involved with William. I didn't know what that was going to look like, but I knew that that was going to happen. So I knew that was obviously going to have ramifications for the sisterhood. And then I also knew what was going to happen to Sylvie towards the end of the book. So I knew that that was coming as well. So I was certainly aware that there were going to be um, shifts and in hills and valleys between the four of them. I didn't know how they were going to maneuver them though.
Yeah.
I loved the character of William. So it was really interesting to hear you talk about William a little. You know, he was so broken in the beginning, and then Julia seemed to rescue him, but in her own way, she made things worse. What attracted you to William and his brokenness? And was he Julia's undoing?
Um, I love William too. I just I I wanted to see if, I mean, it really was like, could he be okay? And I could see that the bright light of Julia and that the fierce engine of Julia would be very attractive to him, and that him being so like moldable and really not knowing what to do would be very attractive to her. And I do think that they served each other for a time. Like he let her mold him, and he allowed her to boss, to make all the decisions and to create the life that she wanted. And a man with more of a spine and more mental health would not have let her be so dominant as she was. It's just like that couldn't sustain itself, and once he finished with basketball was really the breaking point for William, because basketball was the thing that was also keeping him steady in his life. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure I got to the end of it.
Did you have a favorite sister in the book? And was there one sister who was easier to write than the others?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I share DNA with everyone in the book except for Julia and Rose, and which doesn't mean I don't like them. I do, but there's nothing of me in them. And actually, that's what made writing Julia was the most challenging sister to write, because I don't share DNA. And actually, she wasn't hard to write except for in the time where she was changing. So like when William is hospitalized and there's all this drama sort of happening, being put under pressure like that and that kind of challenge changes us. And I could feel my way through Sylvie and William changing because I share DNA with them. I could like intuit how they would change, but I couldn't with Julia. I just had to write and rewrite her scenes until they felt true. And I would say Sylvie probably was the easiest to write. She is probably the most me, but I think there's aspects of me in all of them.
Rose and Charlie had such different personalities. Rose was such a strong presence in her daughter's lives, and Charlie seemed to have no effect on them. Yet you chose the phrase he always used, "Hello, beautiful," as the title of your book. Why?
Well, I think that, twofold. One, when I was growing up, my mother is from a large Irish Catholic family, and we lived in northern New Jersey. And all of my aunts and uncles like lived around us, except for one, my Uncle Ed, who lived in Chicago. But he was there before I was born. And so he used to send me postcards when I was little, and it would be like the Chicago skyline on one side, obviously. And the salutation was always "Hello, beautiful." And I knew as a child that he didn't really know what I looked like because he had like 20 million nieces and nephews and I hardly ever saw him. So I felt like he was seeing that I was beautiful on the inside. And as a very shy, bookish child, I thought that if I had any beauty, that was where it was. So it made me feel good. And I thought that Charlie would use that greeting with his daughters. And the thing is, Charlie does see their specific beauty in each of them. He really sees who they are. And I feel like with that greeting, he calls that beauty to the surface. And so each of those young women really do know themselves by the time he dies in a way many of us don't, because of that love from their father. And they're strong enough inside themselves to each make the bold choice that each of them makes over the course of the story because of him, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really did enjoy the book. And I also enjoyed your newly published old book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
The newly published old book,
Yeah.
Thank you, Ian.
Thanks so much, Debbie, as always. Was "Hello, Beautiful" always the title? Did you know right from the start?
No, it was about a year into it. I'm terrible with titles. "Hello, Beautiful" is actually the only book of mine where I chose the title.
Oh, wow.
Because usually my titles are bad and my agent or editor or somebody is just like, no, we have to brainstorm and come up with another one. But so I had what I generally have is like, I just change the title, like the working title, while I'm writing all the time. And I like try different things out, and I can't even recall what they were for "Hello, Beautiful." But after about a year, I had that thought and it became the title.
Yeah. And it was like, okay, we can go with this. And then it becomes how's it going to look on the cover? And I have to tell everybody, just I can't find my book. I think somebody borrowed it. So I've got Dear Edward and Within Arm's Reach here. So it's not that I just can't find the book in the house. I was chasing around for it before. Kathy Giaquinta had asked this question: do you have sisters? So you have one sister. You have one
Yeah.
sister. So it's not like
I have
you
a
grew up
sister
with a
and
family of 4. It's not like you grew
no,
up
no, a family of 3. I have a sister and a brother.
sister and brother, right?
Mhm.
Terry is going to join us. Terry Kalila, she's from Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. So Terry, so nice to have you with us.
Hi, thanks for doing this again this month. I always love being a part of this. And great to meet you, and love the wallpaper behind
thank
you.
you.
I think it's so fun. So this is going to be a kind of a long-winded question, but I'm troubled by William's parents. He goes off to college, they disappear from the book, never to be heard from until the picture of his deceased sister shows up. I find that hard to believe. He didn't go home. They didn't visit him. Nobody told him that their son tried to commit suicide or that he had a child. It's such a complete disconnect. My first part of my question is there a reason you did this? The second part has to do with Charlie and Rose. So the bigger question is, why did you remove all the parents from the story?
No, nobody's ever put it like that before. That's interesting. I wouldn't have thought of it that way. Okay, so that's very interesting. So the first part, the what happens to William, basically on the first page of the book, actually happened in my family. So not in my generation, but in my mother's generation. One of my uncles was born the same week that his sister died. Basically the same thing, probably pneumonia or the flu. And my grandfather could never look at him because to look at him was to remember the grief of losing his first child, who he poured his whole heart into. And he was abusive to him, and it was just a terrible situation where they couldn't love him because he just represented pain to them. So I watched that. Obviously I'm not of that generation, but I watched the fallout from that over the course, and that never went away. It was never, obviously we're talking about during a time where there was no therapy, there was no healing, there was no talk of, recovery or anything like that for people in the generation of William's parents. It was just particularly, you stiff upper lip, and you stop talking about it, and you drink a lot, and you don't, you don't recover. So they sort of just died emotionally inside, and they were unable to have another child, and yet they had another child. So the fact that I had seen it happen is really how I knew that was emotionally true, or could be emotionally true for William. And although obviously heartbreaking. And then for Rose and Charlie, that's interesting. Charlie, I didn't know he was going to die. Like during the 9 months where I thought about the book, I didn't realize that was going to happen. When he did die, I thought, oh, of course, well, my father just died, and now the father in the book just died. And it was part of like a good example of the way in which I kind of wrote myself into this book during this really heightened emotional time, because I found that I was able to go to the wake and the funeral with the Padavano sisters by writing it in a way that I wasn't able to go to a wake and a funeral for my own father. And it was sad, like it did satisfy something inside of me that I wouldn't have been able to any other way. And then Rose, that's interesting. I don't think of her leaving the book because she remains so noisy, but the thing with her that I find interesting is I think that each generation of this family, it's the idea of like, for women, their freedom is defined by their generation, like what they can aspire to. So Rose gets pregnant when she's young and before marriage, and has to marry Charlie. And then her only path to success is for her daughters to be successful. And when they fail within her own remit, obviously, it's like she feels like her whole life is a failure. And then her only chance for freedom is when her husband dies and her children are old enough that they're grown. So for the first time in her life, she can make a decision just for herself. She has not been able to do that her entire life. And so she chooses to go to Florida. And whereas her daughter, Julia, she is of the first generation of women who could be CEOs it's a massive leap from one generation to the other. And she really is of the super women, generation where Time magazine had that cover with like, the businesswoman with a cape on. And my mother was of that generation. And for the first time, women could completely support themselves. They did not need a man. They thought they could do everything, and that was its own fallacy. And then her daughter Alice has a very different definition of what freedom and success is for her, than her mother and her grandmother. So really, I think I was more exploring that than trying to get all the parents out of the picture, because really Charlie is with them for the whole book, and so is Rose, very noisily on phone calls, etc. But I guess that's the reasons that I did that.
Well, now that you put it in that context, the story has just become so much richer for me.
Oh,
And it's
well,
one I've thought about. I'd never read your work before. I am now a huge fan. Can't wait to hear about the new old book.
thank you
very much.
Oh, thank you, Terry.
Thanks, Terry. So appreciate you joining us.
Always.
It was interesting. Years ago, we had gone to the cemetery where one of our relatives had passed away. I was walking around and I looked and I saw there were 2 children that had died in my mother's family. And I was like,
Oh.
where were these? Like she had 4 other siblings. And I was sitting there like young and trying to figure out, well, where did they come in? Where were they in the order of things? And in the time, like when my mother passed away a couple of years ago, she was in her 90s. It was very different. People would lose a child and then move on.
Yeah.
Another child, move on. And you think about now when we talk about the emotional ramifications of it or whatever, none of that was really dealt with in the same way. And people were walking around with this hurt, but we weren't talking about it. It was lost the child, just keep going. And you didn't realize the ramifications of what was going to happen on your other children because of this.
It's intergenerational trauma, where William has no hand in what happened. He was literally a newborn the week this happened, and it shapes his entire life.
Yeah.
And that's the trauma of his parents, not even, his trauma. It's just visited upon him. It's so interesting to me how we hand that down, and how like the ground under your feet that you walk into your life and has been shaped by what happened to the people before you, whether you know it or not.
Yeah. I remember it was one day when I was first dating my husband, and they had a picture of the children and they were all down in a row. And I knew that his sister was much younger. And he goes, "Oh, that's my little brother who passed away." And I was like, wait. And so the whole family is like, wait, that would have been the younger boy. And that would have been the whole, who's the oldest, who's the middle, who's the youngest, completely shifted by that one change. And then there's a sister who's younger, and you sit there and you look at study family, and you sit there and think about family. There are only 2 in my family. It's a little bit different, but you still see what happens. And I think that you're doing that with this book of like, where do the gears change? How does it change? Just by what's happening.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask a question on behalf of Dennis Neary, who's a very dear friend of Book Reporter, and she's from Rockville, Maryland. Louisa May Alcott fans are devoted, and this book walks on the same sacred literary ground. I love the way she does that. What's the oddest, most interesting, funny reader reaction you've had since you've had to channeling the March Sisters?
Well, first I should say that I didn't intend to channel the March Sisters. I should have figured that out during my 9 months, because I was writing about 4 sisters, and obviously I read and loved Little Women. But it didn't occur to me until I was like 70 pages into writing the book. And in a scene, the Padavano sisters were arguing with each other over which March sister they were. And I was like, oh, of course, there's 4 sisters, 4 sisters. There's William is the lonely guy on the outside. Laurie is the lonely guy on the outside. They both end up with like 2 of the sisters. But I hadn't seen, and of course there's a Beth in every room, basically.
Right.
So once I saw it, and I was delighted. But it's an homage to Little Women and not a retelling of Little Women. I mean, people like to tell me which sister they wanted to be when they were growing up, and I've heard a surprising number tell me that they wanted to be Beth, and I'm like, wow, that's wild. Like, as a child you wanted to be Beth, and they were like, I was kind of a goth, and I'm like, oh, all right. I guess that would be the most amusing response that I've had to it. That everyone has their own association to Little Women and to the sisters.
And do people change according to how old they are, how they're having a reaction to the book? Have you seen that? Like people who are younger see the book one way, people who are middle-aged or older see it different, or same reaction sort of across the board?
Well, the breakdown that I see, and I don't know if I don't think it's an age breakdown so much, but often the people are either really angry at Julia or really angry at Sylvie. Like they either think that Sylvie crossed a line that ultimately should absolutely never be crossed, or they're really mad at Julia for leaving her family. And they go one way or the other. It's like it's a kind of a personality test of the person who's read it, what it is that it triggers inside them, which is always interesting to me. They're almost never angry at William. It's always one of those two sisters.
Well, two sisters. And what did you do and why did you do it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Before we go to audience questions, remember everybody, if you have questions, they go in the Q&A section down below. As promised, I want to talk about Within Arm's Reach, which I finished reading last night and absolutely, really, really, really enjoyed. So for readers who were looking, let's talk a little bit about what Within Arm's Reach is. It was out of print. You wrote it in 2004, which is 22 years ago. And all of a sudden people were requesting this from the publisher because it was out of print. And I love when books go out of print and then it says $75 or $275
Yes.
to get a copy of this book.
On Amazon. Yeah.
Mike, wait, do I have that on my shelf? I mean, what's going on here? So what was it like, first of all, going back to reread your first novel? Because that's not something you don't pluck it off the shelf at night and go, let me read Dear Edward and see how I feel about it now. So you're going back to this first book. What was that like?
I was terrifying. I was really scared to read it again. I mean, I knew that I didn't remember significant things that happened in it, but I was more worried that I was going to think it was terrible. Because I wrote it in my late 20s and I'm 52 now. And, not only was I worried that the writing would be terrible, but I worried like that it would be like foolish or something, like that my younger self would have been consumed with a story that was way too silly or perhaps problematic in some way. Like who knows, what I did that long ago. I didn't think so, but I read it like at an arm's length with like one eye closed. And I was like initially reading it, just being like looking for something that was terrible. And I couldn't find something that was terrible. So luckily I remembered the characters again, and it gives me a real appreciation for who I was when I wrote it. And I had two novels fail before it had not been published. I'd written two novels that didn't get published. And so when I was writing Within Arm's Reach, I assumed it would not be published either. And I just felt like kind of a failure. And I was writing it because I just had realized how much I loved writing and how much I needed to write. And so I was writing that book really for the love of writing, but I had no self-confidence and no confidence in my ability at all. And so I feel really proud of that young woman for writing the book and, impressed even that she did it. So it's been very interesting having like your past be republished.
Yeah, and reading it, it feels like it's very accomplished. It doesn't feel like it was your first novel. And I mean, when I sat there and I was reading it, and it's once again, we've got a lot of people in the story that you're juggling around. And I just thought, let's give you good people who haven't read an overview. We probably won't do spoilers here, but if you just give them an overview of what the story is, because it's really terrific.
Thank you. It's about 3 generations of an Irish Catholic family in northern New Jersey, in the town I grew up in. And the oldest granddaughter gets pregnant and she's unmarried and she decides to keep the baby. And her decision to keep the baby is kind of a cataclysmic event for everyone else in the family. Is my spiel.
That's your spiel. And the book is told from 6 different perspectives. And they're very different points of view. Like when I was sitting and reading, and I would say, okay, I'm going to read till the end of this. And then you pick up the other, and they're in a totally different headset, which is very accomplished for a first novel, even though it was your third. Okay, let's say.
That's my third, so yeah.
Yeah, it was your third. Was there one character that was easier to write at the time? And is there one that you relate to more now, looking at it, 22 years later?
The one that I liked writing the best was the grandmother, Catherine. And actually, she's very much based on my Irish Catholic grandmother. My name's Anne Catherine, and her name was Anne Catherine. And I wear her wedding ring. And she was this tiny, steely Irish American woman who went to Mass every day and refused Novocaine at the dentist. And she gave birth to 9 children, but only 3 of them survived to adulthood. So she had a lot of loss, but she never shared any emotion at all. And she shared none of her interior life. And I think when I was writing it, I wanted to see if I could find the truth inside my grandmother by inventing it on the page, because I knew there was no way I could find out what was going on inside her in real life. She would just never tell me or anyone else.
Right.
So I really loved writing her, and and those were my favorite chapters to read again. And the backstory of this grandmother is my grandmother's backstory, so it was really fun to do that. And I guess the 2 granddaughters who are in their 20s, Gracie and Lila. Gracie's the one who gets pregnant.
Right.
They remind me of my sister and I when we were in our 20s, and a lot of this has made me think about being in your 20s again, because obviously I wrote this in my 20s. And everybody, it's touted as this incredibly fun decade where like you have no responsibilities and no mortgage, but it's actually very stressful.
Yes.
Like, because you're trying to figure out who you want to be and you're trying to make that happen. And it's like you're mashing all these buttons, being like, is this going to work? Is this going to work? Is this going to work? Is this who I am?
Right.
And I feel like I was in a cold sweat for that whole decade, really. And I think these 2 young women are as well. And I really felt for them when I was reading the book again.
Yeah, we really do think that about the 20s. It's like, oh, you can go out, you can do this, that, the
Yeah.
other. And I always say that when you get to your 40s, you get honest, and you don't have to have the best boyfriend, the best husband, the best this, the best that. You just have your life, and you can be more honest about what's going on. But before that, nothing is ever wrong. Everything is always perfect. It's almost like we're lying to ourselves, but it's the only way you get through your 20s. The only way to get through is by lying,
Yeah. You're like, it's amazing. You're like, no, it's actually not amazing at all. Like,
listen, there are a lot of not amazing things about it.
yeah.
Hattie Bullis from Macomb, Michigan asked me to ask these questions on her behalf. She grew up in Somerset, New Jersey, and my younger brother, his wife, and his 2 kids have lived in Ramsey for decades. So it's been fun to read about a setting that I know. The house within arm's reach is so important to the characters in the book. So wondering if the house that's the beautiful painting on the book jacket actually exists in Ramsey. I asked my brother and he did not recognize it. So is that actually forward?
Well, actually, that's my childhood home.
Oh,
That's a
wow.
painting, from a photograph of my childhood home in Ramsey. So it's actually very special to me that so Jessica Miller, who painted the cover of Hello Beautiful, also painted this new cover of Within Arm's Reach, and they wanted to put a house on it, and it is set in Ramsey. So I was like, how about you do the house that I grew up in? So it does exist. Although actually that house has been sort of McMansioned. The newer owners have put like extensions on it and everything, so it doesn't look so much like that anymore.
Was this your room up here?
It was over by the garage, actually.
Or by the garage. Or by the garage.
Yeah.
I love it. And when you think back on your childhood, from my father still living in my childhood home, and you walk in that room and you're like, wow, this is where my whole life was in this.
Yeah.
And when I moved out, when I got married, I just sat there and I was like, I had so much stuff like in that one room. Like now I have like a house I could put it in.
Yeah.
The same reader also shares that she grew up in a huge Irish Catholic family in New Jersey, and she was so glad the book was reissued because it parallels my upbringing in so many ways, especially the accepted lack of communication that was a constant among the older people in the family. And she said she had, their parents had 7 brothers and sisters, her mother had it. And when she was getting married, none RSVP'd to the wedding. And her mother didn't see anything wrong with spending an hour with each on the phone to converse about, like, are you coming to the wedding? And she said, also, a few of the seniors actively speak to members of the family who had died. And a non-family member witnessed this and gently tapped me on the shoulder and told me that my family was a bunch of nut jobs. So did you grow up in a family like this? It was so naturally woven in. And I can't wait to find out that my family is not the only one that speaks to ghosts out loud. So there you go.
Yeah. Well, my grandfather, who was named was Jimmy McNamara, he used to, when he drank, he would tell us stories about leprechauns and he would sing the Irish songs to us. And he would talk to people who weren't like his brother or whatever, who had passed away, in a very lighthearted, not scary way, as if, the people that you love are still in the room with you, which I think is wonderful. Like I think that's actually very delightful. And it is, it is part of the Irish culture. And the closed-lippedness was very much my experience with my grandmother and my aunts and uncles, where just nothing would be discussed. You have these conversations about the weather or the traffic, or, but if there was anything at all going on of any substance, you would never know. Or, if you brought it up, someone would pretend they didn't hear you. It is a very specific culture, which I think probably for the good is dying out. But growing up in it was really mystifying, and I think it's part of why I became a writer, because I was just listening for any and reading faces and seeing how I could possibly get any information from these people to figure out what was actually going on. And it took real effort on my part, and then it took fiction as well, making it up myself.
Yeah, because it was, well, you'd get there and you'd talk about the same topics. Like, you'd
Yeah.
sit down and you're like, is nothing else going on? We used to go down and visit my relatives who lived in Newark, and where did you park? Did you double park?
Yes,
It was
yes.
this whole huge part of the conversation of the
Yeah.
first 10 minutes you're there. And it's like you're watching a tennis match of, oh, you got a spot. Oh, did you do this? Did you move the car? And you're like, really, is this what we're going to talk about Christmas? It's just very funny.
But I think it's nice because actually, I mean, yes, it's crazy, but it's like, that's your family's way of saying I love you to each other. I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. But they're like, did you park the car? How did you park? Is it catty corner? Do you think you'll be all right? Do you think the meter has to be, that's saying I love you in the only way that they know how.
That's exactly. And it's also, they say goodbye for like half an hour. So if they said
Yeah.
to us, we're leaving, we'd never come downstairs because we knew we weren't going to go. Either that or we go down and go back upstairs and keep playing. It was very funny. There were no, quite the rules weren't just exactly what you thought it was going to be. And it's different now. It's just so different because
Yeah.
everything's discussed. Everything is,
Yes.
machinated 14 ways. Do you need to talk about it more? Do you need to talk about it? Yeah, it's
Right.
completely different. It's just
Yeah.
completely different. So on that note of overthinking, we're going to go to audience questions. So Tom Donadio, our fabulous editorial director, is going to be our voice of God on this. So Tom, what have you got for us?
All right, yeah, we have a few questions here. First, from Cynthia, what made you use leaves of grass as Charlie's go-to quotes in the book? I found this interesting.
Oh, thank you. So Charlie, the father, is he loves poetry. I think he probably is a poet, though we don't know that he writes his own poetry. And I just knew right away that Whitman was his poet. It's just the sort of the dropping of boundaries and the expansiveness and about how we're all connected is very Whitman and very Charlie. And it was one of the things during the research I read, I think 3 biographies of Whitman, because I knew he was somehow going to factor in. And the thing that really fascinated me was that Whitman writes and rewrites and re-edits Leaves of Grass 3 or 4 times. He republishes it 3 or 4 times during his lifetime because he was a publisher as well as a poet. And so he would edit the poems and take out some and put in a new one and publish a new version of Leaves of Grass 15 years after the first. And that kind of re-editing yourself and retelling your story / your poems over the course of your life was so interesting to me. I had about more of that in the book, and my editor was like, that's too much Whitman. And so there's less now. There's too much basketball and too much Whitman, because whatever it is that my obsessions and whatever catches my fancy, I go overboard. And that's why I have an editor.
And you'd be quoting about basketball and Whitman at dinner. In the kitchen, what?
Yes, exactly. I can't contain my enthusiasms.
We're getting Knicks tickets for Christmas.
Exactly.
So we have this question from GJ. Was Pat from Within Arm's Reach an early version of William in Hello, Beautiful? Born the same week his sister died, abused by his father. Seems like there were other characters in each book who were quote unquote related to each other. Was that intentional or just common themes that you draw on when you explore family dynamics?
Yeah, that's very insightful. That's very good reading. Really, what it is that there are stories from my family in those 2 books, and only in those 2 books of the books that I've written. So it is again, as I said, I hadn't read Within Arm's Reach in 20 years, so I had forgotten. I mean, I knew that a lot of it was sort of, it concerned my mother's Irish Catholic family. So there are families from that story in it. And as I said, this happened to one of my uncles where he was born the same week that his sister died. So that story is in Within Arm's Reach, and it's also in Hello, Beautiful. I don't know that I don't think it's not as central, obviously, in Within Arm's Reach, so I didn't remember that even that it was in there. So it's more that coming from this family that had all this loss and a lot of difficult times and never spoke of them. Their stories really lodged themselves in me once I learned them, and so they came out in both those pieces of fiction. I feel like in a way I wrote the first book certainly to try to set these silent people free in a way by sharing them in a way that they wouldn't be able to share them themselves, and probably again in with William in Hello Beautiful.
And we have a question about Dear Edward from an anonymous attendee, who says there was a character who wore jingling clothing jewelry and lived reincarnated lives, taking over the bodies of others. Then she became a fortune teller and met Edward and his friend. She was a unique character. How did you come up with her? What were you trying to say with her character? And how did she take over the bodies of living people?
Wow. Okay. So on the plane in Dear Edward, there's obviously a number of really different people on the plane. And that was part of the fun as a writer, is that like everybody flies and there's a first class and there's coach. So like I could write people in different socioeconomic classes who were on a plane for different reasons, etc. And that was really fun. And actually, in the 9-month period for Dear Edward, where I was not allowed to write pretty sentences, but I was researching, I had to figure out who was on the plane. And I wanted the characters to be really different from each other. And one of the things that I did was that I sort of read outside of my normal genres. And I read sort of in research of each of those people on the plane. There's a billionaire in first class, and I read Jack Welch's autobiography, the guy who ran GE for a long time. And during that 9-month window, I also read Neil Gaiman's The Sandman series for the first time, which is like a set of graphic, I guess, novels, graphic stories. And Gaiman like does not abide by any of the boundaries that you think you have to follow as a storyteller. Like he will have a character who is dreams, who, the characters will live for thousands of years. You have death who like literally walks among you, etc. And something about reading Gaiman made me think, why can't I have a character who thinks that she's lived multiple lives? Like there are people who believe that they have. And so it was Gaiman who led me to create Florida, which is this woman who was on the plane, who, like Shirley MacLaine, sort of most famously believes that she sort of is reincarnated over and over again. And indeed, after the plane crashes, there is a fortune teller in New York City who the boy Edward sees, who could be Florida in her next incarnation. And it explains it in the book, like what Florida's idea for it is. I can't remember it exactly anymore, except for I think if that person is almost about to die, she can enter. And so she has entered the fortune teller's body. I would actually have to check that myself in Dear Edward, but that's the basic idea. Either someone is about to die and that leaves space. That is one of the beliefs of how you can be reincarnated, or obviously you enter as a baby. But for the fortune teller, I think she must have almost died and Florida entered her. So the rest of you are like, what is she talking about?
Well, do you know what's really funny is you're sitting there talking about a book you wrote, okay, that you wrote a couple of years ago. I've had a number of authors say to me, something comes up in a book club discussion. I'm like, wow, that's really prophetic. And they're like, you wrote it. And they're like, I don't remember at this point. I've got so many characters. It's like, I have to reread, like, which book are we going to talk about at this event? Because I have to know what we're going to be speaking about, because I got to get myself back in that head, especially if you're working on something else, at this point.
Yeah, 100%. It's very hard to keep all those worlds living inside of you in the detailed way.
Right.
And we have one more question from Denise, who is curious to know if you will ever write about the pandemic.
Oh, interesting. As of right now, I'm actively avoiding writing about the pandemic. Maybe I will at some point, but like the book I'm working on right now, part of figuring out the timeline of it was so that I could make sure that it ended before the pandemic started, because I don't want to write about the pandemic. Part of my writing genesis actually was that when I was in college, after my junior year in college, I got sick with a big virus called Epstein-Barr. And I was always healthy and have been always healthy since then, but I was sick for 3 years, and it took me an extra year to finish college. And actually in the midst of that, because it made me realize, like, when you're 20, usually you have so much energy, and I felt like a very old woman in this body, and my immune system was wiped out, and I had only a little bit of energy every day, and I had to decide what to do with it. And that's where I was like, well, I'm going to write because that makes me feel better. And also it made me realize that I really did want to try to be a writer, because life could change on a dime. Like, I felt like I got hit by a bus by getting sick like that. And then the fact that I had Epstein-Barr puts me at a higher risk for long COVID. So I've actually continued to be very cautious, even, after most of us have stopped, just because I don't want to have long COVID.
Right.
So I feel like I still am living in the pandemic in too many ways. And it's like, it's the last thing that I personally want to write about. But maybe in the future.
It's going to be such a strange time to be writing about. A lot of people are saying, I've got to start the book before, or I've got to start the book after. And you
Yeah.
also run into certain times, like we have so many ways to communicate now. And you couldn't get yourself out, like you'd be texting each other and you'd be saying, if it's not the 80s, you're immediately able to do all these things. And you don't live in the moment. You don't live in the moment because you're constantly looking at what we're going to do next. I say that, you don't surreptitiously find someplace because you're being told a map of exactly how to go, and, everything is being charted out for you. And it's just so different. And I know a lot of thriller writers say it's really hard right now with Ring cameras. It's really hard.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, you live in the New York area, so on the news at night they'll say, here's so-and-so who beat up such and such on the street. And the guy has like a hat down to here and something like, here. And the next day you go, we found him and he's been arrested. And you're just there like, wow, that's amazing detective work of what you figured out.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. It's all the communication things are hard to write about. I do prefer, like, Hello Beautiful is basically, most of it is set in the 1980s, and it's kind of blissfully Luddite during that period.
Yeah. Yeah, like even Dear Edward, he would get off the plane and start texting everybody and telling them, like, I'm sitting in this seat and come get me here. It's not the same. Not the same.
That's true.
We have a question that just came in from Mary Beth. She says, she asks, is there discussion now on turning Hello Beautiful into a series or a movie? I love the Dear Edward series.
Oh, thank you. It's been optioned to be turned into a television show by the Obama's company, Higher Ground. And it's in like the script writing phase. I'm not involved in writing the script, but so we'll see. I mean, it's like the first step has happened, but there's so many hurdles, like so many points of failure in bringing something to any kind of a screen, that it's kind of miraculous. It's very miraculous that Dear Edward was on the screen 3 years after I published it. So we'll see what happens with Hello Beautiful.
And it was really well done. It was really well done. You really felt like the character, the actor who played Edward was just perfect. I mean, he had that look of not knowing and really being like, what is going to happen with my aunt and my uncle and who are all these people? So somebody's asking where Dear Edward is. I'm trying to remember. I mean,
it's on Apple. It's on Apple.
Yeah, Apple. Yeah. It's always the thing where you're like, well, I heard about this one. Where is this one?
I know. Where do you watch it? Yeah.
My husband hands me the remote and goes, just, you know where it is. I'm like, yeah. Tom, is there another question?
That actually wraps up the Q&A.
Wow.
No more questions.
Wow. So I have a question for you. So where are you on what's next? Are we in the 9-month period, or have we gestated the baby? Is the baby moving along?
We've gestated the baby. I've been writing it for almost a year now, actually. So, and the obsession that led me into this one was trees. I read The Overstory by Richard Powers probably 2 years ago, and it just blew my mind, as it blows so many people's minds. And obviously that book is about trees and the advocacy of trees and the history of trees in a million, different ways, so brilliantly told. And it really just sort of broke my brain open. And when I read a book that I really, really love, I always seek out all the interviews that I can find with him or her to hear them talk about it. And so I listened to a bunch of interviews with Richard Powers after this, and I had never read any of his other books. And he said the same thing in like 3 of the interviews. And it was that he thinks that it's the responsibility of contemporary writers to diversify their storytelling. And that not only to diversify their storytelling in telling the stories of different peoples, which is of course incredibly important, but also to diversify it into telling the stories of the world that we live on and the earth that we live in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's necessary in order to help raise the consciousness of humans in a way that it has to be raised in order for us to have a chance to continue to be humans on this planet. And I just felt like it just sort of hit me in the chest, and I'm like, okay, I have to try to do that. Like, that seems right.
Mm-hmm.
And so the new book I'm working on is set on the cul-de-sac that I grew up on in Ramsey, New Jersey. And it's about the people on the cul-de-sac and the trees.
Oh, I love it. I love it. I have to say that I feel like I need to study trees because people pick up a leaf and they go, oh, this is a maple leaf. We have trees all around my property and I have no idea which
It's
leaf,
hard.
what.
It's like it's a foreign language. Because I'm trying, and like I've read so much about trees in the last like 2 years. But it's like trying to learn, Greek at this age or something. I'm like, I can, like I'm memorizing what I can, but it's not intuitive in any way.
Yeah.
But it's wonderful.
One of our trees dropped like little seedlings, and I said, if we did not go pull these out right now, we would have a forest just in one part of the garden. And I mean, it's like absolutely crazy. And they come out really easily because they're, they haven't been living there that long. But it's just like we walk out in the yard and I was like, oh my gosh, I think they made more overnight. I mean, this is like crazy. And it's like every time I turn around. So I had somebody helping us plant the other day, and her daughter was with her, and she's like, look, I'm pulling them out. And I was like, great, just keep on going. But
what are they? Do you know?
I can't remember what they are. That's the exact thing. I don't remember what they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Tom, what's Richard Powers' new book that's coming out? I think it's September, right? What does he have?
Oh, really?
Yeah. Tom, you went to the lunch for it. Richard Powers Playground?
Yes,
Playground.
That's it. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, he's got a book coming out in September. So yeah, something new to be thinking about. But it is true though, you go to write about something and you always have to go learn about it and you have to learn more. And we've had a big problem with ash trees dying in the area, and you have to be taken down because they have no leaves, and you're watching and all of a sudden you're learning what those trees are. So it is fascinating to me of the ones that are, we had a big tree in the front of the house, and you probably find this interesting. It's like, oh, my husband goes, I'm afraid that's going to fall down. And I was like, why? It's got leaves on it, everything. He goes, because there's a squirrel living in the trunk of it. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, it went in the side and it didn't come out. So we had a tree expert come over, and I love this. He goes, it's just like us at this age. He said, it's like, it's not structurally sound, but it looks good on the outside. And I was like, oh, that's a good line.
Yeah, that's very good.
Took it down completely hollow inside. And I said, big rainstorm, like one big wind, and it would have done this.
Oh, wow.
That obsession with trees. So you're into the writing. Do you see a timeline on this one, or it could be?
I'm hoping, I have almost 300 pages now. So, but that's still first draft. So I don't know, hopefully another year of writing and it'll be done, which means it would probably come out a year after that. So that would be, I can't do math, 20, that was
6, 7.
Yes. Yeah. Something like 6. Yeah.
I just feel like from 20 to 24 went like that. And now all of a sudden we're saying, like, why are we doing 26 and 27? But yeah, for a lot of books now being bought, those are the years.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So we'll see. I'm enjoying writing it. So
that's the best part. That's the best part. You sit down and you feel good, and you haven't written yourself into a corner where it's like, okay, now what am I going to do? Are you also somebody that massages like a paragraph like all day? Like I've said, people say I spent a whole day on a sentence or on a paragraph. Are you like that, or you just keep moving?
I'm not that person, but I do, sir. I'll just rewrite endlessly. And just like and then I read it from the beginning to where I am, and then I'm making tiny notes all along the way. So like, but I will not relentlessly obsess on one sentence. It's just like every time I get back to that scene again, I'll try and make it a little better, and that could be sentences as well as dialogue, etc.
Yeah.
It's just like whatever is needling me, I try to fix.
Yeah, you sit there and you go, that's just not.
Yeah, it's just not right. It's not there yet.
It's just not harmonizing. We're just not harmonizing in that moment.
Yeah, exactly.
So thank you so much for joining us this evening. This was absolutely a pleasure. Absolutely a pleasure.
Thank you, Carol. Oh, it's a pleasure for me too.
And it was nice to be able to do 2 books and actually 3. We actually managed to
Yes.
talk about 3 books. You talk about juggling like an author's career. Here we go. This is what we do sitting here, folks.
Yes.
So I hope you come back for the next book, and
I would love to.
sooner, and then we'll be able to do this as well, where we can actually have readers sharing like real questions with spoilers. That's what we love about this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so nice. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who came. And thank you, Tom and Debbie and Terry.
Thanks so much. And onward to our next thing. We appreciate your taking the time. And we've got a couple more announcements from us. Tonight's event will be available on YouTube and on our podcast probably later this week. And we will alert everyone who signed up when that goes live. And our next Bookaccino Live book group will be on June 25th. It's a Tuesday night this time, folks, at 8 o'clock in the evening. And our guest will be William Kent Kruger. And we'll be discussing his New York Times bestseller, The River We Remember, which was a recent Edgar Award finalist for Best Novel. And then on Wednesday, June 12th at 2 o'clock, we're going to be hosting our monthly Bookaccino Live book preview event, where I'm going to talk about books releasing between June 11th and July 2nd with a look ahead at August titles. And sign up, you can do that on Bookreporter right now. And to stay up on top of everything we're doing, like our Bookaccino Live Lively Book Group monthly events, contests, sign up for our newsletters, including our events at tbrnetwork.com newsletter, so you never miss anything. And a reminder, I have interviewed more than 190 authors at our Book Reporter Talks to interviews. So jump out there. They're on our YouTube channel. If you've read a book and you want to say, oh, not everybody reads the book the week the book comes out. We know this. So you have a chance to go back later on when the author is not doing the Today Show and the author is not the Oprah pick. And you can find her a year later, 2 years later, and go back and still see what the author was sharing. So with that, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Be a part of this evening. Your participation is something that's so important to us as well. So thanks, everybody, and good night.
Thank you.